So we've already seen that our first intentional tort cause of action that causes a harm to a person is assault. Assault, we said, is a voluntary and intentional act that causes another person to be placed in a reasonable apprehension of a battery. And when you take that definition and you break it down, you can see the following elements. There must be a voluntary act, there must be an intent to assault, there must be causation, and the defining element is there must be a reasonable apprehension of a battery. We also noted there are a couple of policy reasons for this tort. One is that we don't want people worrying about walking around in public without being accosted by other folks, so we're trying to protect their peace of mind. We also want to prevent possible breaches of the peace when people get attacked because their natural response is probably going to be to fight back. We're going to break down the forbidden consequence element of assault into its component parts. So the first thing we'll look at is, what do we mean by an apprehension? We already noted in class that apprehension does not necessarily mean fear. That is, if a person is subject to assaultive behavior, they don't have to be scared or fear that they're going to be injured. Apprehension really just means awareness or recognition that this potential victim is about to be contacted. And the idea here is that if you're aware that someone is about to batter you, then you're likely to fight back, and that's going to trigger all of the policy concerns that we talked about earlier. Now, there's a couple of different tests for apprehension, and both of these tests must be satisfied. First, there must be subjective apprehension by the potential victim. This means that the victim must actually experience apprehension. When they see something that's approaching, they must truly believe that they are about to be contacted in a harmful and offensive way. But that's not enough. You also must have an objectively reasonable apprehension. So, despite whatever your subjective belief might be, we would ask whether a reasonable person would also experience apprehension or awareness under the facts of that particular case. Once again, it's not enough just for there to be a subjective apprehension. There must be both subjective and objectively reasonable apprehension in order for the apprehension element to be satisfied. So let's take a closer look at the concept of subjective apprehension. We'll use the Collison versus Medley case to see what kinds of acts can create a subjective apprehension of a battery or of a harmful or offensive contact. We know in this case that there was an older gentleman who was making overtures toward a 16-year-old girl. The family of the girl finds out about this. They're not too happy, and they decided to confront Collison, our older gentleman, in his trailer. Now, the case does a very good job of laying out the circumstances that Collison claims created his subjective apprehension. There were a number of family members, and they were surrounding him in his trailer, and so he believed that they were about to do something, and he couldn't really leave. There was also a number of physical acts, especially Ernest, the father, had a holstered weapon and constantly kept moving his hand toward that weapon, and Collison believed that he was gesturing as if he were about to pull out the gun and shoot. He did this in conjunction with some verbal threats that he was going to jump on top of Collison and do bad things to him, possibly including shooting him. At another encounter 2 months later, the family also made some menacing facial expressions, some angry glaring toward Collison, which led him to believe that he was in danger. He felt like they had been stalking him, not only 2 months later, but in some other encounters. And because Collison was aware that Ernest, the father, had engaged in prior violence, he felt like all of the things that the father, Ernest, had been doing were indicative that he was about to be dangerous or violent toward Collison here. So when you put all of these circumstances together, Collison makes the argument that he had this subjective apprehension that he was about to be battered. Now, ultimately, the case does go on and talk about whether the apprehension was not just subjective, but also objectively reasonable. And the court, in fact, does find that given all of these circumstances, it was reasonable for Collison to believe that he was about to be battered. So, in the next slide, we'll consider more specifically the kinds of criteria that courts will use to justify a finding of reasonable or objective apprehension. We'll use the Brauer versus Curley case to get a better handle on the rules for reasonable or objective apprehension. Here, the Curley brothers ran a billboard business around Seattle. Brauer was an activist who disliked billboards, and he was taking active measures to try to undermine their business. Of course, the Curleys didn't take kindly to this, and so they, over a period of 20 months, started calling him, leaving kind of nasty messages, and sometimes having some veiled threats attached. All of this culminated 20 months later when one of the Curleys wound up making a series of phone calls on the same night. And the messages get kind of worse and worse in their tone. At one point, they said that they were going to kick his butt, and ultimately, the last message said that they would cut him in his sleep. Well, Brauer was so upset by all of this, he brings an assault action against the Curleys, contending that the phone calls and the whole pattern of their behavior created a reasonable apprehension of a battery. The court winds up doing a very nice survey of the rules here for determining what is a reasonable apprehension. And it lays out 3 rules in particular that are important to remember. Now, these are all kind of sub-rules that help us determine when, in fact, an apprehension will be viewed as a reasonable apprehension. First, whatever threat is being made by the defendant must be imminent, and imminent means virtually immediate. It must appear to the plaintiff at the time that he or she is just about to be contacted by the defendant. If there's any gap or pause, that's going to be insufficient. Second, the defendant must have the apparent present ability and desire to carry out the battery. So if there's a conditional threat that if I had my gun, I would do some harm to you, that's not going to be sufficient, because it would be clear to the plaintiff that the defendant does not have the present apparent ability to carry out the threat with the gun. And all of this really kind of dovetails into the idea of imminence, that if the person really doesn't have the capacity to carry out the act, then there's no immediate danger of a battery. The third sub-rule is that the threat must be accompanied by some kind of act or gesture. Usually words alone are not going to be sufficient. And this also goes to the idea that unless someone is acting in furtherance of a threat, then the threat is probably not imminent, and we don't really know if the defendant is serious about following through. Now, courts have recognized in a very general way an exception for extraordinary circumstances, that is, where all of the circumstances considered together might lead a reasonable person to believe that he or she might be assaulted. Now, the court winds up applying these rules to the facts of this case. The plaintiff had made the argument that he was under a reasonable apprehension because he actually satisfied the extraordinary circumstance exception to the imminence or immediacy rules. His argument was that their words, in combination with the fact that these words were spoken at night over the phone after a 20-month period of stalking, would lead a reasonable person to believe that they're just about to be battered or harmed by the speaker. The court winds up rejecting the plaintiff's argument and basically kind of goes through all of the factors that weigh against the plaintiff's case. First, the court says that there was no present ability for the Curleys to carry out any threat. They were on the phone, and there was no indication that they were close enough that they'd be able to almost immediately spring upon Brauer and cause him harm. As far as we know, that they were at some kind of remote location. There also hadn't been any threatening gestures. Picking up the phone was not enough because that in itself would not create an imminent threat. And so without anything other than picking up the phone and speaking the words. There was no gesture to indicate to Brauer that he was just about to be contacted in a harmful or offensive way. And because there was some substantial distance between the Curleys and Brauer, their spoken threats certainly could not lead to imminent violence, because it would take them a while to get from wherever they were over to his house or apartment in order to inflict that injury. And so because we lack all of those criteria, the court said that this was not an example of a reasonable apprehension by Brauer. The court does note, in a part that's left out here, that there could be a cause of action for intentional infliction of emotional distress, and that might be one reason why the court was not willing to expand its interpretation of these factors. Now, if you're thinking about, well, what would be a good illustration of a case that satisfies the circumstantial or extraordinary circumstances exception, I would suggest to you that something that involves either a threat by a gun or a bomb, that is, if someone were to come up to you and appear to be holding a gun and make a threat that if you don't give me your money, I'm going to shoot, my guess is a court would probably find that there would be justification for that victim to believe that they're about to be injured or killed. And it's the quickness with which you can pull out a gun or to detonate a bomb that could give rise to enough imminence without a clear gesture in order to make this an assault. So in this case, just to wrap up, there was no assault, and it looks like if any cause of action is viable, it's more likely to be a cause of action for intentional infliction of emotional distress. We'll tie all of this together finally with the Boonton versus Allstate Insurance Company case. Kind of an interesting case where we had a gentleman who was in his home at Halloween, and a bunch of teenage boys came up wearing army fatigues and carrying plastic guns. He claims that he was so fearful that he closed the door and locked it, went back and retrieved the pistol, then came and opened the door, and as he opened the door, thought he saw a flash of light, which led him to believe that there might be gunfire, and so he did wind up shooting one of the boys. He was actually indicted and tried for second-degree murder and ultimately acquitted, but then he decides that he was also a victim, and so he brings a lawsuit. Now, in Louisiana, you're actually able to sue the insurance company that represents the insured who allegedly did something wrong, that is, the boys that were carrying the gun. So if you were wondering why the insurance company was named as a party, that's why. It's one of the few states that allow an action against the insured's insurance company. So this is an assault action by our plaintiff, who claims that these boys had induced his reasonable apprehension of a battery when they came to his door on Halloween night carrying their plastic weapons. On the subjective side, he claims that because he saw the army fatigues and because it was nighttime, that he had reason to be fearful, and that's why he went and got his own gun. And when he came back to the door, when he saw the flash of light, he thought perhaps he might have been under fire, and that gave him the subjective belief that he needed to defend himself, and that's why he fired his weapon. So the ultimate question here is whether or not that belief is objectively reasonable under the circumstances, and it obviously isn't. There might be some kind of gesture because the boys were carrying guns and perhaps they were moving the guns about when they came to the door, but the court says it was not objectively reasonable to believe that there was an imminent act of violence, or that they even had the apparent ability to carry out the act given the plastic guns that they were holding. And when the court goes through the facts, you can begin to see a number of factors that support this conclusion that this was not an objectively reasonable apprehension. The first telling sign is this was Halloween, and of course there would be a lot of young folks walking around with costumes, possibly including young boys that are wearing army fatigues. Second, the appearance of these antagonists, they're teenage boys, and so they're relatively young and small. Their uniforms look obviously fake. And so the court said he didn't really, the plaintiff didn't have a justification for believing that he was under assault by actual Army personnel. In terms of relationship, there was no prior bad blood between them to lead him to believe that these particular boys had come to his doorstep in order to do him wrong. As far as we know, they didn't utter any threats to him to indicate that they were about to assault him in any way. And finally, the question of his reaction seems to loom large here. If he really thought he was in danger, he could have simply kept the door locked and called the police. But that was not his response. His response was to go and get his gun, come back to the door, and then re-confront the folks that he thought were about to do him wrong. So when you put all of those factors together, the court says he didn't really have a reasonable justification for believing that he was about to be assaulted by some militia personnel. He really had what seems to be an unreasonable belief, and because of that, he cannot sustain his assault action.